What is NATO preparing for next? And how have its members articulated and voiced their position in joint statements on the threat from Russia? Where is Ukraine in this system of common defense, European security, and global security? Of course, the summit went as planned. There were no sensations, and the only pleasant surprise was that NATO was still there. Unfortunately, following the events of July 8 in Kyiv and the shelling of Okhmatdyt, all summit participants agreed to include support for Ukraine's inevitable accession to NATO in the final resolution. President Biden initially opposed this inclusion before July 8, but after witnessing Russia's terrorism and inhuman methods of warfare, all participants reached consensus. For Ukraine, we understood that there would be no invitation, no consideration of Ukraine's accession to NATO. But in all other respects, as far as financial assistance to Ukraine is concerned, all parties have fully ratified this agreement on the allocation of 40 billion euros, 43 for 2025, which means that we are guaranteed to have funds. The next summit, which will be held in The Hague in the Netherlands, will consider the budget for 2026. This decision was made by the alliance. First, a new command will be created in Germany, which will take over all command, training, logistics, supply, and training of Ukrainian troops that will be deployed in Germany from the U.S. Secretary of Defense due to the precautionary measures. That, hypothetically, President Trump could come to power in the United States on 20th of January next year, and he could put a spoke in the wheel, and the whole work of this mission would be eliminated, blocked, and therefore it is being withdrawn from the custody of the United States and transferred to the custody of alliance officials who will take over these powers. They also made the final decision that there will be a new civilian special representative to coordinate all the work on assistance to Ukraine from NATO, which will be designated in the near future. The issue of bolstering Ukrainian air defense was discussed. Apart from the 5 systems already mentioned, numerous tactical systems, potentially hundreds, will be manufactured worldwide and deployed at medium and short ranges to provide air defense for these strategic assets and others being transferred to us. The issue of allies in the Indo-Pacific region was discussed, including Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. This is important for Ukraine because the summit recognized that China is Russia's accomplice in the war against Ukraine, and that it is equally responsible, and that NATO, the European Union, and the United States will impose additional sanctions against it. I say for continuing to help Russia. If China did not help Russia, then Russia would no longer have any resources other than human biomass to conduct real combat operations in Ukraine. And it is China alone that fuels the Russian army, its ability to fight, by and large today. And NATO has assessed this in quotation marks and will draw the appropriate conclusions. It's important that South Korea, and possibly Japan, I don't rule out Japan because both have robust military-industrial complexes and are powerful economies among the top 7 or 10. They can significantly aid Ukraine with their extensive ammunition production capabilities, which are larger than those of the United States or the European Union. Korea could directly supply Ukraine with its weapons and ammunition, or through intermediaries from the country of Ramstein who will purchase it, and then Ramstein will transfer it to Ukraine. The main thing is that the president of South Korea, who did not block this permit after the events of 8th of July in Kyiv, should unblock it. I think these decisions have been made. We also discussed the issue of launching strikes at a longer range, deeper into Russian territory. You probably already know that the British Prime Minister has stated that we have never granted such a restriction on the range of Storm Shadow. We gave them to Ukraine, and only Ukraine determines where to use them, certainly within the framework of international law, only on military targets, not on civilian targets, as Russia does. So we have no reservations. French President Macron has also never given any restrictions on the use of scalps, as long as they are used exclusively on military targets. Therefore, Ukraine has been operating at least 2 cruise missile systems smoothly for months. The Germans' reservations about Taurus are currently irrelevant as they did not provide it. Regrettably, the U.S. has not supplied us with the long-range ATAC-MS, and if they have, permission has not been granted. We need the appropriate permission from the U.S. I expect this issue to be resolved today, Thursday morning in Washington, which will be 4 p.m. in Kyiv. When there will be a personal meeting between Biden and Zelensky, this decision was made and will be made hypothetically, not at the NATO Summit, where there are 32 participants, where there are hundreds of people, where information will leak, but only a personal conversation between Biden and Zelensky, without any witnesses, without anyone, when Biden, for example, can hypothetically allow long-range strikes on targets in the Russian Federation. Only military facilities, but nothing will be said about this. No warning will be given in the media. On the contrary, Kirby will most likely come out again and say that nothing has changed in the U.S., that they do not see the need to give Ukraine permission to fire at a distance of more than 100 kilometers into Russian territory, because we believe that this is unacceptable, and Ukraine will have such permission by then. These are my wishes. I think that perhaps, after the events of 8th of July, Biden will decide to give such permission only for military airfields, headquarters, ammunition depots, and fuel and lubricant depots. At least this list of 4 items would be of great help to us. Provision of ATAC-MS missiles with this appropriate range. That's how I would describe this summit in a nutshell, Mr. Andriy. In fact, today we are looking forward to the meeting between Zelensky and Biden. We believe that there will be positive developments, and we are also quite optimistic about the ATAC-MS, which have proven themselves very well in terms of this tactic and approach. And we see that in recent months, since we received permission to strike at least the territory of the Belgorod region, the border areas of this region up to 100 kilometers, there have been no excesses. There hasn't been a single use of this weapon by Ukraine that was incorrect or contrary to international norms, humanitarian norms, conventions. We are only hitting military targets in the Belgorod region, and there have been many comments from the military, from the local authorities of the Kharkiv region about these strikes. Preventive strikes have saved many lives in the Kharkiv region, eased the situation in Kharkiv itself with bombings and shelling. Strategy is effective and should be expanded and sustained. Isn't this a compelling case for our USA partners? Certainly arguments. In the Kharkiv offensive, more than 90% of the personnel who were advancing were killed in the period after 10th of May. In other words, Ukraine is making significant gains and local victories, at least in specific areas of the front line, after being allowed to attack deeper into the territory. And this is despite the fact that May was the most numerous month for the destruction of Russians, more than 36 to 37,000 in 1 month, up to 40,000. I want to tell our viewers that for 6 months now, Ukraine has been disposing of and bringing to the trusts of the wounded Russian military occupiers every day in the range of 100 to 1,200 people. And this is calculated over a month, it comes out to more than 35,000, and in 83 days, it comes out to 100,000. So, within 3 months, 1 quarter, we have 100,000 troops. Over 4 quarters number would reach 400,000, assuming the current intensity. This increase is primarily attributed to enhanced supply, following the U.S. Congress's approval of $61 billion, with an additional $40 billion now provided by Europe. Supply intensity for Ukrainian armed forces with artillery shells, mines, ammunition, equipment is improving, yet insufficient for full readiness. Despite NATO and Ramstein securing funding and obstacles, as Zelensky noted, 14 newly formed brigades still lack equipment and cannot be deployed to the front lines. Ukraine also needs to be supplied with weapons on a daily basis, which are running out. We need to supply more than 100 brigades along the entire front line, which are also engaged in local battles. And against this background, NATO is creating another 35 to 50 newly created brigades on the eastern flank. They won't create them in 1 year, but in 3 to 5 years, they will be established and completed. These 35 brigades, each with at least 3,000 personnel, totaling at least 100,000 personnel, require weapons, ammunition, tanks, artillery, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, air defense systems, aviation, helicopters, planes, and more. These parallel processes of intense battle and supply to Ukraine are depleting our ammunition and weapons from the West. They cannot simultaneously supply their own needs and ours. This poses a significant challenge, so we urgently need assistance, potentially from Japan and South Korea, to fully equip Ukraine with everything it needs in a matter of months. It was discussed at the NATO Summit convened by Biden ahead of the crucial U.S. election. He is holding a press conference. He will not be answering via teleprompter, but directly to journalists. He is receiving a lot of attention from all over the world, from opponents, from Republicans, from Trump. They will study him in detail, what he says, how he answers, what his reaction is. I think that they will use this very much in their internal political struggle and pay attention to it. Much of his press conference will be devoted to Ukraine and China. The issue of China is very important for NATO, the EU, and the entire democratic civilized world to be able to block Chinese supplies to Russia so that Russia does not have the resources to fight against Ukraine. And so in this context, this topic and this press conference will be very important. We literally have up to 5 minutes left so that we can finish this topic and summarize it by 9 a.m. I would also like to ask you, Mr. Yuriy, for your opinion and the interpretation of this wording that appeared in the declaration following the summit regarding Ukraine, which is the full irreversibility of Ukraine's full membership in NATO. What does this mean overall? We know there was debate about whether to include this wording in the text, and it passed, indicating that every country, every member of the alliance, supported this wording by consensus. That Ukraine's full membership in NATO has no alternatives and is virtually irreversible? How do we understand this? As a promise that this will happen one day? Or is it an assurance that our cooperation with the alliance will continue to grow and develop? Please explain. NATO is also building an additional bridge, as they say. The word bridge was used at this summit, that if there is political will, Ukraine will immediately join NATO. Even faster than Finland and Sweden, when the conditions are created for this, such conditions will include an unconditional end to the war in Ukraine. Again, on what conditions, if it is a triumphant victory or just a victory for Ukraine? This is Ukraine's unimpeded accession to NATO, of course. If it is through negotiations, then God forbid that the subject of negotiations and bargaining there is not Ukraine's acceptance of NATO, but Ukraine's rejection of NATO. To prevent this from happening, because you know that Putin is now putting forward his demands and ultimatums everywhere, that he will not sit down at the negotiating table and will not go to any second peace summit, by the way, especially before the U.S. presidential election, until the result is announced, whether Trump wins or does not win for Putin, which is long overdue. That is why he is unlikely to go to any peace talks before the results are made public. Results will be announced by the end of December, and the new president will be inaugurated on January 20th. I'm unsure if any summit will include the participation of the RF. The inevitability of Ukraine's accession to NATO includes training, development of logistics, development of defense institutions, support for mobilization, rotation of military personnel, veterans' benefits, medical support, training of civilians, a whole range of measures that will ensure the inevitability of Ukraine's accession. The most important thing in this resolution was the reform of the military, democratic and civilian. They avoided specifying the nuances in the resolution to maintain the festive and solemn atmosphere of the summit, choosing not to include everything they discussed. They will verbally communicate to President Zelensky what they believe Ukraine needs to do to join NATO. As the president of Estonia mentioned recently, Ukraine's accession to NATO could potentially be a topic for negotiations with Russia. Russia cannot be given carte blanche to join or not to join and block the veto of new members. Russia cannot have such a mandate. Therefore, the West is demonstrating with this resolution that Russia will not block Ukraine's accession to NATO, or rather, it will not be able to and will not be given such levers, it will not have the right to veto, and Ukraine will have the right to join NATO when all these conditions are ripe. If Ukraine ends the war, implements reforms, fights corruption and so on, it will be accepted into NATO. The timing of Ukraine's NATO membership is uncertain. Some experts suggest we need a timetable for Ukraine's accession. If hypothetically Trump returns to the White House and serves for 4 years, the timeline for NATO membership could be uncertain. This uncertainty adds many unknowns to the equation. Thank you very much for your comprehensive answer. Romaniuk was with us, and we talked about the relationship between Ukraine and NATO and the interim results that we can already announce and call the summit in Washington, the anniversary summit of the alliance.